Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Jen Lerner is the Thornton F. Bradshaw Professor of Public Policy, Decision Science, and Management at the Harvard Kennedy School and co-founder of the Harvard Decision Science Laboratory. In addition to her roles at Harvard, Jen served in a Pentagon assignment from 2018 to 19 as the Navy's first chief decision scientist and a special advisor to the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations. Jen serves on a diverse set of boards, including the scientific advisory boards for two corporations in the machine learning and decision-making space, as well as the faculty steering committee for Harvard's Mind, Brain, Behavior Initiative. Jen received her PhD in psychology from the University of California, Berkeley. Jen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we were chatting just before I hit the record button, and I said I was very excited to have you on for a number of reasons. One, you are a renowned researcher in affective science or emotions research, and you have a lot of seminal work covering the basic mechanics of emotion in the mind and brain. But at the same time, you also have this ability and or willingness to sort of zoom out and look at the bigger picture, which in my experience, in my training as an academic, in my PhD, is sort of an uncommon combination. If you have somebody who's really in the weeds of the mechanics, especially the neurobiology of emotions, in this case, it's often that you don't see sort of that combined approach. So I think it's going to be very interesting to hear your insights, and will be really relevant for listeners as well. And selfishly, I'm also really excited because I came from, my laboratory was called the Social Affective Neuroscience at the University of Toronto. So I've always had this deep interest in emotions. It's been some time since I've dabbled in them and done any sort of experimental work, though I'm trying to sort of pull it back into the work that I do with my clients. So all that to say, you are the first emotions expert on the show. And I think it would be really exciting to dig into some of this stuff with you.
Thanks, Nick. I'm honored to be the first emotions expert on the show.
Yeah, that's right. So I, just to start us off, I once watched you speak, or I can't remember where or when it was exactly, but you were talking about how you even got into emotions research to begin with, and you were trying to do this moral outrage induction. And it sort of wasn't working, and then you got it to work somehow. Am I reading that right?
That's
memory correct?
Exactly right. So when I started my PhD program at UC Berkeley in the 1990s, it was really the kind of waning end of the cognitive science revolution that took place in the second half of the 20th century. And cognitive science was still really the dominant dogma, that maybe dogma is too strong, but the hot area that everyone wanted to understand. And if we go back even further, just to give listeners perspective, because some might wonder, hasn't it always been the cognitive science zeitgeist? And the answer is no, because the first half of the 20th century was dominated by behaviorism. And this was Skinner and people like that, Watson, who talked about stimulus-response relationships. Then the second half of the 20th century, psychologists rebelled against that view and said, wait a minute, it's not just stimulus-response, it's stimulus-thinking response. We have these human brains that guide our responses. And so that was a huge revolution in academic scientific psychology, and it really was going strong for the whole second half of the 20th century, which was when I started graduate school in 1992. And for almost the entire 20th century, there was virtually no research whatsoever on emotion in psychology. So some other fields, certainly people in the humanities, didn't stop studying emotion. They understood that emotion mattered. But in psychology, emotion was very out of fashion. And so people, really leading researchers in the early part of the century, like Skinner, one of his famous quotes is, "Emotion is the fictional cause to which we attribute behavior."
Wow.
And so, yeah. So basically, he was saying, you're deluded. You don't know what you're talking about if you think emotion exerts causal effects. And people believed him, and emotion was viewed as an unscientific thing. You wouldn't want to study it. You're super silly. If you do study it, really, it's epiphenomenal. It's going on in the background. It's not a causal factor, etc. And furthermore, even if it does matter, there's no way to study it scientifically. So leave that to the artists, poets, and philosophers. But we scientists are not going to dabble in emotion. And so that was the view. So it never, in my wildest dreams, occurred to me when I was writing graduate school applications to ever say that I wanted to study emotion. It didn't even seem like within the realm of possibility. And so what I thought, I was so indoctrinated in this cognitive way of looking at the world that I knew that I wanted to study moral outrage. Interestingly, this is pre-contemporary times, where now we live in a whole new level of moral outrage. But back then, in the 1990s, I wanted to study that and moral decision making. And I had a sense that I wanted intense feelings, but I didn't realize that I needed to study emotion to study that phenomenon. What I thought I needed to do was just create scenarios that people would read that were clearly unfair, and that this reading of cold cognitive facts that were unfair, where, for example, people were treated unfairly in a legal system, where there's bias in jury decision making, things like that, that people would get to this moral outrage state. And so I did a bunch of studies on this, and nobody ever felt moral outrage in my study. And I went through a funny period of time in graduate school where my first advisor left and there wasn't someone else who made sense as an advisor. And I'm a very independent kind of person, so I was just going along, doing my thing. And occasionally I'd make appointments with various faculty members who weren't my advisors. So I made one such appointment with Bob Levinson, who's a leading luminary in emotion science, and told him what I was studying and explained to him that it wasn't working. And he said, well, of course it's not working, because this is an affective, and by affect, I mean global feelings. This is an affective process. And you're never going to get moral outrage unless you prime anger. And it seems so ridiculous to me in hindsight that he had to tell me that. Because
but this is before, I guess, like Haidt's social intuitionist model, where I guess the understanding even amongst academics was that it was sort of moral decision making was very rational and cold.
Completely. So this is like 1994, and I thought, well, I did think there was an intensity to it, but I didn't have a vocabulary or any scientific understanding or any theories or anything to help me understand that it was emotion. And it really, I was insufficiently well read, because philosophers actually had been writing about the fact that, like, philosophers like Robert Solomon had been writing about the fact that without anger, there is no justice. And that anger is sort of the lubricant of the human justice system. And so had I been reading more philosophy, I would have known that, but it certainly wasn't in psychology at the time. And so, sure enough, I started to prime emotion, started using multi-sensory stimuli, videos, things like that, with lots of sound and visuals, things that are emotionally evocative cues. And boy, did I get moral outrage.
There you go. And it's like you said, in hindsight, it's fascinating now that now we're where we are, we can understand how important and how integral they are to moral decision making, but decision making generally.
Yes, yes.
And
And one of the things, if I may say, one of the things I discovered in that particular series of studies is that anger, once primed, can not only influence the judgments or decisions at hand, and we refer to that as integral emotion, but also can carry over to influence other judgments and decisions that should be, from a normative, rational standpoint, irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And nonetheless, the anger carried over, and we call that incidental emotion.
And that would be, just for listeners, I love this distinction. I used it in my own research a few years ago. So that would be akin to someone like a guy at work who's just been reamed out by his boss for something he did. And then he's in this sort of, he's upset, he's angry, and he comes home and takes it out on his dog or family. Mm-hmm. Could we sort of consider that as an incidental state of anger?
Yep, exactly.
And it's so intuitive, right? Like as soon as I sort of explain that story, I think a lot of people listening will be, oh yeah, I've done that, or I've had that happen to me. Where, and so emotions, we know there's these appraisal processes, but they're super complex, and we have things like emotional intelligence, and that varies such that some people tend to be more in tune with their inner emotional states, where they can understand the source of it and then act rationally or act accordingly. But we know that emotions are really, really these weird things. And even one of my first studies I tried to run with a lab mate was looking at, we also wanted to prime not moral outrage, but anger. We gave students this really crappy feedback on an essay they wrote prior to coming into the lab, and it compared them against their peers, and they got like a failing grade. And then we hooked them up to physiological measures. So we wanted to assess 3 levels of emotion, which was self-report. How angry are you telling me you are? Physiology, which was, okay, what's your heart rate? What's your galvanic skin response? And then the third was economic giving, like in an ultimatum game. So that's a behavior measure. And what we found was nothing actually correlated. There was no clean like sort of relationship between any of the 3 levels. I don't know if you have experiences like that in running experiments related to emotion, and what do you make of that when it comes to actually studying these things in the lab, let alone out in the field?
So let me see if I understand your question. You're asking, what do I make of it when hypotheses are not upheld, or what?
I guess more to do with like when we examine emotions, it seems they're these complicated things, more than cognition, if we can sort of create that dichotomy. And what a person says, what a person feels versus what they tell you versus what their physiology does, and then how they behave doesn't always align. And so my question is, what's your experience with studying that, and how does that make it tricky or hard for you as a scientist?
Yeah. So we actually had a small grant and a series of studies where we looked at concordance or lack thereof among different kinds of emotion measures. And so, for example, if someone is induced to feel sadness, can they say, I feel sad? And what does that look like in the autonomic nervous system? Questions like that. And what we found is that overall, there are a ton of moderators. And the moderators make sense because we're such social animals that for a variety of reasons, we want to deny we're feeling certain things that we are feeling. And because we think they're not socially appropriate, or we think they won't make us look good. And and those are situationally dependent. And so I think in general, we humans do have remarkable ability to infer what we're feeling, but with some individual differences in that. But there also are many reasons why we've conditioned ourselves to not actually register what we're feeling or say what we're feeling. The thing that we study the most is when we induce people into one emotion and then later ask them to make some judgments or choices, and we later ask them, did what you were feeling at the time, perhaps as a result of the video you saw, influence the decisions you made? And if it seems like it would be rational for their feelings to influence them, then they say yes. And if it seems like it would be an irrational carryover effect, not only do they say, no, it didn't influence me, but they also take offense at the question. And they say, for example, we have a paradigm where we induce sadness in a particular video, and then some questions we ask them to write answers to. And then later on, we have them make a bunch of economic decisions with real money involved. And we routinely ask them, was there any connection there? Is it possible that the video in any way influenced you? We've even gone so far as to say many people are influenced by the video, and we tell them ahead of time. And still, not only do they deny that they themselves were influenced, but telling them that many people are doesn't wipe out the carryover effect of sadness.
That's interesting, because you think it's almost like you're establishing or you're communicating to them a norm, which we know guides much behavior, and still it doesn't budge.
Yeah, and I think that the reason it doesn't is that they just can't believe that they would be susceptible that way, because it seemed so irrational. So they assume that it's somebody else who is influenced, but not them.
My mind always goes to like sort of functional adaptationist arguments or explanations. So if we have this is this irrational response within us, there's this almost this resistance to come to terms with the truth or with reality. Why do you think that's the case? Why are we so reluctant to just admit what's going on?
Well, I think that we have an implicit lay belief that we are rational. And that lay belief makes sense because on average, in a lot of circumstances, we are. But there are also some circumstances where we just don't have introspective insight into what our minds are doing. And that's a really unpleasant thought. And, you know, all day long, we're going around, our brains are constructing reality. And we see something and we think to ourselves, that's reality. That's what I'm seeing there, reality. That's what everyone else is seeing, reality. When in fact, we've constructed an image. And my reality is not necessarily somebody else's reality. And, you know, there are many visual illusions that reveal this. There's one with just geometric shapes, a rectangle and 4 lines. And if you put a rectangle over those lines, it looks like 2 lines instead of 4. And when our brains look at it, we don't think to ourselves, my brain is constructing this reality. I am seeing this particular image and seeing the way that the rectangle is making me perceive the lines. That's not how we live life. We live life in a constructed world that mostly we get by with.
Yeah. And because I guess imagine if our ancestors didn't have that constructed reality to just get by, I think we would have been eaten long ago by some saber-toothed tiger or maybe some sort of hominid ancestor, because you can't just navigate the world constantly wondering what's reality versus not.
That's right.
So it's a functional thing. So it makes perfect sense. I had a question, and now of course it's escaped me, which I guess there's a sort of rise of behavioral science, of course, why I'm even doing this podcast, and with the books of Thinking Fast and Slow and Predictably Irrational and Nudge and these things. Everyone's talking about behavioral economics and applied behavioral science, behavior change. And yet, and I've been tracking this, for the last 5-10 years, and surprisingly, they're quiet on the role of emotions. A lot of these interventions, whether it's policy or for profit or in different organizations, there's such little talk of the role of emotions, even though we know, like subjectively, phenomenologically, and even at the level of the brain, that emotion is so closely tied to behavior. It sort of puts us into a state of readiness, puts an organism in a state to act and to behave and to decide. So despite that, there's still not much talk of emotion. Do you get that sense as well? And why or why not? And if that's the case in your mind?
So emotion is the newest part of this behavioral science wave. We've been at the cognitive aspect for much longer, as we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. And so it is less ripe for application relative to the cognitive effects. So I think it makes total sense from that perspective. And then there is also a feeling that there's something mischievous about using emotion to influence behavior, where it might be okay to change cognitive frames, like use a default versus not use a default. That seems less objectionable than using emotion. A doctoral student of mine and I have started writing on this, where we're starting to get a handle on it by probing the underlying ethical principles that seem to undergird these perceptions, things like allowing for autonomy and allowing for transparency, the things that are dimensions of fairness, of perceived fairness. And emotion can really call into question whether you're messing with someone's right to autonomy.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's like a person's okay being, just to use the language of practitioners, a person's okay to be nudged if in an unemotional, cognitive sort of way, but as soon as they pick up any indication that they're being nudged through an emotional means, their back goes up against the wall.
Yeah, they feel manipulated and like their autonomy has been threatened. And also that it lacks any kind of transparency, in part because emotions are a mystery to most people. And
which goes back to that point you were saying earlier.
So that said, there's also a different set of objections, which is that there's ethical considerations to be taken into account, because inducing a negative emotion is in fact harmful, because negative emotion states correspond to biological effects that could be harmful. And as well as anyone, how deep in the brain emotion is hardwired and how many projections different emotional centers in the brain have to regulating the autonomic nervous system, and a variety of other central nervous system processes. So there's potentially harm in negative emotion state induction. And the place where I think right now we're starting to see people use that, though, is on cigarette packages. So recently, a new law was passed. For a long time, you've seen these graphic images on cigarette packages in Europe, but it hasn't been legal in this country because the big tobacco companies have blocked it. And finally, it's been made legal, and now people are going to have really disgusting looking images and things like that on cigarette packages. So that's one way that emotions will be used in a nudge-like way. The thing that concerns me is that, at least in public health, many people are actually using emotion, and they've been doing it long before the whole behavioral science revolution, so to speak. And they've been doing it with an assumption that emotions are intuitive and everyone understands them if they have emotions. And so, for example, the Centers for Disease Control has spent $54 million on an anti-smoking campaign. It's called Tips from Former Smokers. And many people will probably have seen some of these videos on TV. Some of the more memorable ones are a woman who's missing part of her throat.
Yes, that's right.
She's had surgery. Yeah. So this is Tips from Former Smokers, $54 million. And they were made without drawing on emotion science. And they were made with this idea that if we prime negative emotion in these videos, people will associate smoking with negative feelings and then not smoke as much. So in my lab, we actually coded. We had a bunch of smokers rate their feelings when watching these videos. And the number one emotion evoked by those videos is sadness. It's number one in terms of the frequency of all the different emotions. That's the one experienced most frequently. And in terms of the intensity. So the intensity of the subjective experience. And we now have a whole bunch of evidence showing that when it comes to financial decisions, sadness makes people impatient, and it makes them pay more to get things, and it elicits a craving state. And now we just finished a paper that last week was accepted to proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showing that sadness, more so than any other negative emotion, increases cravings for cigarette. And we actually brought people into the Harvard smoking lab, where we hooked them up to these devices for measuring the topography of smoking. And sadness actually increases the volume of how much they inhale.
Wow.
Moreover, sadness predicts relapse 20 years out in a population that smokes. So it predicts smoking in the moment. It predicts smoking 20 years later in a longitudinal study. It predicts the amount that you inhale in the moment. All of the evidence we have suggests that smoking is not the emotion you want to induce as a way to reduce smoking.
And the CDC should have come to you before they spent to the tune of $54 million.
So I can't necessarily blame the CDC because, again, emotion science has been a slow science with a very odd history.
Yeah.
And all kinds of attempts to squash it. I mean, Margaret Mead among them, the anthropologist. It has a really, really strange history as a scientific field. And so now I think that it's really our job to catalyze the research and get it into the hands of people who can make use of it.
To go back to that, that's fascinating. This paper with sadness and increasing cravings. If not sadness, what what emotion state if we're sort of taking the discrete approach, what emotion state do you think would be most effective for smoking cessation? I have sort of two, but I'm curious to hear your hypotheses, or if those are even addressed in that set of studies or any others.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, we think about this a lot. And so we didn't just say, oh, let's try sadness. We had very specific reasons for believing that sadness would have this especially strong effect. And the underlying appraisal structure of sadness is such that it automatically triggers heightened self-focus. We were not the first to find that. Many people have found that. Sadness is a self-focused emotion. And it also arises from a sense of loss. And it has this effect of triggering an implicit goal of replacing loss. So the key cognitive aspects of sadness are that it's negative as opposed to positive. It's self-focused as opposed to being focused on others. And it's a focus on loss as opposed to gain. The emotion that is most opposite on those key dimensions is gratitude. Gratitude arises from a sense of gain and is associated with a focus on others. And finally, it's positive. So we're doing studies trying to look at the potential for gratitude to debias some of the harmful effects of sadness. We have a paper in Psychological Science called The Financial Cost of Sadness, showing how much money people in a sad state give up just to get money sooner rather than waiting for more. So they choose smaller, sooner amounts rather than larger, later amounts. Gratitude has the opposite effects. It makes people more patient. So they choose larger, later amounts rather than smaller, sooner amounts. So we're hoping that what we found in the financial decision-making domain will also work with smoking and other addictive processes. And by the way, I want to make sure I point out that we have this massive opioid crisis. And for the most part, psychological or emotion scientists have been relatively mute on this. And I think it's a real challenge for our field to start to try to address this. And that's why we did these studies with addictive substance use, is to try to say, let's look at emotion where it's harming us most. Oh, so by the way, to go back to your question. So gratitude is one candidate, and the other one is disgust.
Okay, so that's what I was thinking was disgust, because just to go back to the cigarette packages, which has been in Canada actually for, God, I don't know, maybe 5-7 years or so. So I'm used to seeing them on cigarette packages. If I were to run those through a test, I would conjecture, I would guess that it would be disgust would be the primary emotion that they elicit. But I didn't actually know that about the US, that it's only until recently.
Very recently.
Wow. Huh. Interesting. And generally this notion of sad, like, okay, so going back to this point of emotion and behavior change and sort of why people are quiet, and there are these serious and important ethical considerations and concerns. That's especially the case I see now. If this knowledge of emotion science and affective science ends up in the wrong hands of, say, certain businesses, brands, and retailers, if retailers and these big e-commerce sites know that sadness, or inducing a state of sadness, or finding an ideal target user or customer who's in a sad state is going to lead to more delayed discounting, and maybe the propensity to buy now, then maybe they would want those people to be in a sad state to get those ideal target customers into a sad state so that they could buy now. Do you think we have to be concerned about that, or is that just me being super cynical and pessimistic?
We absolutely have to be concerned about that. And so the field that is most jumping all over these effects is the marketing field.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. For good, or to avoid the bad, or to do the bad?
I would say it's a complete mix. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and all the more reason then to have, the behavioral scientists and the behavioral practitioners on those teams, or at least consulting on those projects, so that they can point to the deleterious and the nefarious outcomes of these things.
Well, I don't think we're necessarily such angels. I mean,
yeah, that's
I think that just like everyone we study needs to have some clear situational guidelines, constraints, etc., I think we need that as well. I think that it's very easy to rationalize unethical behavior as ethical. And when someone's paying you enormous amounts of money to do it. So I think just having a behavioral scientist on the team is no guarantee that it's going to be ethical.
Yeah, that's true. I think we're a good bunch, but yes, we're human. We are human after all. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. I have so many other questions here. We didn't even get into the work that you do. That they always do. All these conversations I have with people, which is good, which is a good sign. So we'd love to have you back on, especially to talk about some of the work you're doing with decision science and the Navy, which I know listeners will be particularly curious about. But for the first part one, Jen, it's been great. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks. I'm happy to come back, Nick.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.